Hey folks, welcome back to Battle for Azeroth. So I finished leveling my hunter in order to do the Hati quest chain. I wanted to do that. I finished that, as you can see. I have my two Hatties here. And it seemed like a good time to talk about Beast Mastery. I'm going to label this state of / theory crafting. I think that makes a little more sense to focus on more class specific things rather than going over everything every time. So we'll talk about Beast Mastery, and then the theory crafting will be more around Barbed shots. So couple things if you decide to do the Hati quest chain. I would say I was below 300 item level. I think I was like 250. Close to maybe, if you rounded it off, 260. I would say it probably wouldn't hurt to maybe get a couple pieces of gear. When I looked it up, the only requirement was you had to be 120. I did complete it without having to do anything else, although I had a little bit of difficulty, shall we say. So the other thing I would say is, from what I've read, you can complete it in all three specs. You just have to be Beast Mastery in order to do anything with Hati. Without kind of spoiling anything, you'll get him towards the end of the quest chain, as you might imagine. I would say, while Beast Mastery maybe isn't the strongest hunter spec right now, I think that's safe to say. If you did it in Beast Mastery, which I did, I would say use a Spirit Beast so you had a self-heal. That was kind of part of my difficulty. So other than that, no problem. There were just kind of certain points where I had a little bit of difficulty. So other than that, I pretty much went over everything during the state of video for beta, so there's really nothing that's changed here that jumps out at me, other than Barb Shot is the new ability. Fire a shot that tears through your enemy, causing them to bleed for X amount of damage over 8 seconds. Send your pet into a frenzy, increasing attack speed by 30% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. And you will notice, as we go over these, that a lot of talents synergize with Barbed Shot. So these are my talents. I've played around with these. This seems to be the most efficient / enjoyable setup I have figured out. I've done my best DPS with this setup. I was doing Wrath of the Lich King, Time Walking Dungeons, and PvP. And then when I only did those for about a day before they ended, and then I did some island expeditions and what have you, and I was in the Time Walking Dungeons and PvP around that time. I was around 115, a couple levels above that. I was top DPS, I'll say. I was doing pretty good, both in dungeons and PvP. Wasn't necessarily, top DPS in PvP per se. I was doing better than I normally do. I was one of the higher DPS. As I got closer to like pretty much 119, my DPS dropped off for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know if just my gear wasn't. I got quite a bit of gear from doing time walking dungeons, so I think I was staying pretty well on par. I probably wasn't geared as well as I could have been, of course. However, I was geared better than I normally am, because normally I've been just doing battlegrounds and questing and things like that. So my gear's been a little lackluster, I think is probably the way to put it. I wouldn't say subpar per se, but a little lackluster. It could always be better. Leveling is trying to gauge your DPS leveling is kind of difficult because you're just kind of getting random pieces of gear. You're not really, running a dungeon or a mythic dungeon or a raid or something for or doing a world quest, what have you, for a specific piece of like epic gear or anything like that. So nevertheless, I did pretty good until I got about 119, and then I kind of started to play with things again. So this was the setup when I logged on to start leveling. This was the setup I had left with. I was in Beast Mastery, so I just stayed in Beast Mastery. And yeah, so I took Animal Companion. Originally took Killer Instinct, I believe. Kill command deals 50% increased damage against enemies below 35 health. So, Dire Beast, I didn't like it. It was lower here in the talents at one time, and I just never. To me, I'm kind of indifferent. I just, good ability. I see a lot of hunters taking this. I just didn't really. I don't want to say I didn't like it. It just didn't. With the way that I play Hunter, it just didn't synergize, I guess would be the way to put that. So it's kind of the same thing with Demonology Warlocks now. You have to summon a minion essentially to do damage, and I'm just not a big fan of those abilities. So took Killer Instinct to begin with, and then noticed that my DPS was just not. It was low, as I remember. It was just not. As high as it could be. It's kind of tricky to on abilities that a target has to be above or below a certain amount of health. It's kind of they're situational abilities, obviously, but it's kind of tricky to get full advantage of them. So I switched over to Animal Companion, which summons the first pet in your stable. Your stable being the first slot of your stable master, and that's why I have 2 Hatis here. So they will obey kill command, but they do not gain any use from their family abilities, so fair enough. So I'm assuming that means kill command does double the damage. So instead of doing 3,000, I do 6,000, essentially. I'm assuming. It doesn't specifically say that, but that is my assumption. And it's kind of weird because they could have very easily put text in that said, damage is doubled from kill command or something. Your pet will obey kill command, damage is doubled, something like that, and they did not. So that is my interpretation of that. I have no reason to believe otherwise. So I took Chimera Shot after having Scent of Blood. And this is kind of where the theory crafting starts. So, Scent of Blood, Barbed Shot generates 8 damage, generates 8 additional focus over its duration. So this is kind of, this would be one of my complaints with Beast Mastery. This is kind of the weird thing about it now. Is Barbed Shot is the only baseline ability that generates focus. So it generates 20 focus over 8 seconds. If you take Scent of Blood, it generates 28 focus over 8 seconds. Which, if you only wanted to have to prioritize one ability, if you only wanted to have to focus on one ability for focus, that would probably be the way to go. Chimera Shot generates 10 focus for each target that it hits, and it has a cleave ability. So it hits your primary target and another nearby target, dealing nature damage to one and frost damage to the other. So if you only have one target, that's fine. If you happen to be fighting 2 or 3 targets, that is also fine. So it actually does 2. At the very least, it's generating 2 more focus than Scent of Blood. Now, I will admit, I am kind of torn here because Chimera Shot is probably the more fun of the 2 abilities. Of course, Scent of Blood being a passive ability. And it has a shorter cooldown. Chimera Shot took the place of Murder of Crows. I like to try to simplify my rotation as much as possible. So when I took Chimera Shot, I switched out Murder of Crows. So to kind of understand my thinking here, so Murder of Crows was here where Chimera Shot was. So Murder of Crows has a 1-minute cooldown. Chimera Shot has a 14-second cooldown. And I really couldn't see the sense in taking both. I've soloed, with this setup the way it is, I have soloed players in PvP, which is rare for me depending on the class. I tend to do that depending on the level and the expansion. I've done that on Warlock. It's not so uncommon on anything else. Normally I tend to play a healer or something, so it's kind of new territory for me to be able to do that. And part of the reason I was able to do that was Chimera Shot, because it only has a 14-second cooldown. So I was able to do damage, generate focus, kind of. It's a more, with this kind of setup, I found it's a more flexible play style. You can you have a little more control over things. So, Scent of Blood is not bad. I did switch back to it around 119 when I was kind of playing around with things, trying to figure out what to change. So I took Scent of Blood and took Barrage instead of Chimera Shot, just to see, because you're really not strong on AoE. Multi-shot will trigger Beast Cleave. And if you have the focus and you can spam it 3-4 times, you can do a decent amount of AoE damage. The key word is if you can spam it 3-4 times. Just using it once or twice really isn't going to do much. So switching back, having one ability to rely on, and where did I think it was Stomp? Yeah, when you cast Barbed Shot, your pet stomps the ground, dealing physical damage to all nearby enemies. So having one ability that generates focus and kind of does, puts a dot on and does AoE you're putting a lot on one ability. Granted, it does have 2 charges. It was nice having to only focus on one ability for only having one ability that really was a primary focus generator. However, the flexibility of having Chimera Shot, I think slightly, and the fact that you have potential to generate far more focus with this, especially if it hits a second target, you've generated as much as Barbed Shot without having to wait 8 seconds. So, one with the pack, I tend to use Call Wild as a cooldown, basically, or aspect of the Wild. Wild Call has a 20% chance to... Wait. Wild Call, there we go. We'll eventually figure it out. Your auto attacks, auto shot, critical strikes have a 20% chance to reset the cooldown of Barbed Shots. Which, quite honestly, happens often enough even without taking this. So I couldn't really see the point. And I only use Aspect of the Wild, which increases your critical strike, which would increase your auto attack critical strike. I tend to only use that as cooldown. So, yeah, a chance. Chimera Shot is definitely one of the better choices here. I guess this would come down to preference, depending on how you played. I find that I had to use Bestial Wrath, and I was popping Aspect of the Wild. I got a trinket that increases critical strike, and then has the on-use effect of increasing attack power. So when I was popping everything, in especially island expeditions, I was doing pretty decent DPS. So not really much to complain about there. But then otherwise, I really wasn't using Aspect of the Wild, and Call of the Wild was still proccing. I didn't really notice, where it was a... I didn't notice it not proccing enough to justify taking a talent for it. So, Natural Mending, every 30 focus you spend reduces the remaining cooldown on Exhalion. That's by 1 second. So, normally I would take Camouflage just because. However, I mean, I really don't think this is... I really don't think this is very good, because even though you are... I go through focus quite a bit, and it just doesn't seem to be quite enough. I think if they just tweaked it so that it reduced the cooldown by 2 seconds, maybe? I never find it off of cooldown when I need it. I either just don't use it, or it's constantly on cooldown. So that tells me this passive really is not doing as well as it could be. Trailblazer, your movement speed is increased by 30% anytime you have not attacked for 3 seconds, which for PvP really isn't all that useful. Normally, movement speed is rarely a bad thing. However, with a tier like this, when you have it's kind of weird, because you have one ability that affects a spell, and then you have another spell that will cloak you, but reduces your movement speed, which is kind of the opposite of what Trailblazer does. So it pretty well, I think this one pretty well comes down to preference. I don't know that there's really a good or bad choice here. There's maybe an obvious or an optimal choice, which I'm going to go out and say is probably natural mending. Seen a lot of hunters take camouflage. Haven't seen too many take Trailblazer. So, yeah, it's a bit of a weird, especially in PvP. If I'm not attacking, I'm most likely going to be on a mount, running somewhere to do something. So I just couldn't see if it just increased movement speed just all the time. I could maybe see it as being a little more viable. As it stands, I'm kind of torn between natural mending and camouflage, and I'll probably go back to camouflage at some point. So, wanted to give natural mending kind of another try, and it just doesn't. As I've said, there's a few of these abilities that when you do something, they reduce the cooldown of something else by a second, and I just don't think they're all that good, really. So, Thrill of the Hunt, again, kind of theory crafting Barbed Shot a little bit. Barbed Shot increases your critical strike chance by 3% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Now, this definitely, I can say through experience, is a worthwhile passive. I could have kept Murder of Crows. Honestly, I've used this for several expansions now, and I just wanted to do something different. I'm just getting kind of tired of using it. So, it's a staple of PvP. Yes, it's not a bad ability. I just wanted to do something different, and I really didn't want to have 8 abilities down here. 7 is already far more than some classes have, and I have abilities on other bars and everything else. I mean, you already have kind of a lot going on in terms of damage / utility. So when I switched to Chimera Shot, I said, okay, I'm going to put that where Murder of Crows was, and then I'll swap Murder of Crows out for something else. When I swapped back, when I took Scent of Blood around 119, I swapped back to Murder of Crows just to see if it was any better as far as DPS or what have you, and I definitely seem to notice the lack of critical strike with Barbed Shot. So it was still a good ability. Thrill of the Hunt essentially makes a good ability better. So yeah, and then as I said, you know, with Aspect of the Wild, and also increasing critical strike, I mean, you're not doing too terribly bad. In some ways, it vaguely reminds me of playing a Fire Mage because you're stacking your critical strike to a point where you're heavily relying on it in many situations. The only difference is you're not doing anything you're not doing anything out of your normal rotation necessarily to generate the critical strike. You're just kind of running through your rotation as you normally would, and the critical strike is stacking, is building up. So, Venomous Bite, Corporate Shot reduces the cooldown of Bestial Wrath by 1 second. Again, it's one of these passives that you do something, it reduces the cooldown of something else. It wouldn't be a bad ability. I use Bestial Wrath a lot. It's one of the few classes that I use I kind of think of this kind of as a utility. because it doesn't directly do damage itself, but it makes other things do damage. Or it increases damage, I should say. I use it a lot because of Killer Cobra, which we will get to. So, again, 1 second, I just kind of looked over it. Thrill of the Hunt, Murder of Crows, either one. There is quite a bit of difference between having Chimera Shot, which has a 14-second cooldown, and having an ability with a 1-minute cooldown. Granted, if the target dies, the cooldown is reset. That doesn't always happen, especially in PvP. You end up with an ability on cooldown, and 1 minute isn't a long cooldown. I kind of thought about taking this and just using it kind of as a cooldown, even though 1 minute's not really all that long for an ability. It's kind of in the middle. I thought, well, I could take it and then, use it situationally. I think Thrill of the Hunt is better. I'm getting use from Thrill of the Hunt. Every time I use it. So, and I pretty well keep this on cooldown. That's actually how I've noticed the procs, is that it will most likely be on cooldown and then the proc will happen, and that gives me I believe it's a free charge from that. To reset the cooldown, or resets the cooldown, yeah. So, yeah, not too bad. Bit of a strange ability for Hunter, I think. We don't really... I know dots were a thing back in the day, especially with like Beast Mastery. It's just a strange how all this kind of synergizes. It's just a bit unfamiliar might be the word. So, yeah. Post haste, disengage, also frees you from all movement impairing effects and increases your movement speed by 50% for 4 seconds. So, of course, a lot of hunters will take Blinding Shot. I already have Tar Trap and Freezing Trap. Also have Intimidation. So, don't really feel like I need another ability. Having something that frees you from movement impairing effects is definitely worthwhile. Born to be Wild reduces cooldown of Aspect of the Cheetah and Aspect of the Turtle by 20%. I've used this. It's not bad. Post haste definitely can be more valuable though when you need it. So, especially in PvP, of course. Stomp. Now, this was a tier that I would say I'm a little disappointed. It's a little lackluster. I feel like I took Stomp to try to synergize with Beast. When you cast Barbed Shot, your pet stomps the ground, dealing X amount of physical damage to all nearby enemies. Now, I swapped this out for Barrage when I was kind of playing with things around 119. And Barrage is kind of the thing that most hunters just go for straight away. The Barrage is not a bad ability. The thing is, you can use it while you're moving, so it doesn't always... It's a strong AoE that doesn't always hit as an AoE. It tends to focus on one target. I've used this quite a bit, several different times, and I've always kind of had the same experience. Stomp, the advantage with this is as long as your pets are, you have a little more control over where the AoE goes. as long as your pets are at the target, they're going to do AoE damage. Now, the weird thing is, if you use Barbed Shot, if you haven't attacked an enemy, and you use Barbed Shot, it will trigger Stomp. So it essentially will be worthless the first time you use it. However, once your pets charge in, you would think maybe it would wait until your pet got to the target and then it would trigger Stomp. No, it doesn't do that. Unlike some abilities have in the past, it triggers as soon as you use an ability. So it's a bit strange in that way. However, as I said, once they are engaged with an enemy, whether it be PvE, PvP, every time you use Barbed Shot, and this is, as you can imagine at this point, this is an ability you're going to be using a lot of as a Beast Mastery hunter. You use this every time. It doesn't have a cooldown. It does pretty decent damage, considering this essentially does what the passive does for Flame Strike on Fire Mage. It does about the same amount of damage. So it's not that I dislike Barrage, it just doesn't work quite in the way that I would like. It's just it just scatters, directly in front of you, and that's it. So a lot of groups have been wiped because a hunter used this and pulled more than they were intending to. So Stampede, I've just never cared for Stampede. Kind of like Dire Beast, 3-minute cooldown's a little long for what it does. It's not a bad ability. I've used it before, and I've just never really cared for it much personally. So Stomp, I'm getting a benefit from every time I use Barbed Shot. So especially with like island expeditions, there's plenty of chance to like pull a bunch of smaller enemies. If you have a melee that is not a tank, just doing damage, having the AoE, whatnot, your pets are going to be taunting. So works kind of nice as far as like a tanking aspect goes for your pets. So. And then Killer Cobra. When Bestial Wrath is active, Cobra Shot reduces the cooldown on kill, or resets the cooldown on kill commands. So you basically just use kill command, Cobra Shot, kill command, Cobra Shot, kill command, Cobra Shot. Occasionally you will use Barb Shot just to keep your focus regenerating, or Chimera Shot, one of the two. Aspect of the Beast. I've tried using this. It looks good. It increases damage of your pets by 30%. Increases effectiveness of your various spec abilities, class abilities, what have you. Just really was kind of a lackluster ability. I just did not see much of an increase with this, which was disappointing. Spitting Cobra. Summons a Spitting Cobra for 20 seconds. It attacks the target for X amount of nature damage every 2 seconds. While Cobra Shot is active, you gain 2 focus every second. This seemed like... Again, one, I just really didn't need another ability, and it just seemed like something I would have trouble with kind of coordinating, which may not make a lot of sense. I trying to envision using an ability like this in combat, whether it be PvP, PvE, what have you. I could see myself having trouble. You kind of, after you've played for, kind of played the game for a little while, I would say at least through one expansion, maybe two, you kind of get a sense of what abilities you know, would kind of fit your playstyle and what wouldn't. I generally don't play things in a kind of cookie cutter stereotypical way, so I have a pretty good idea of what I will like and what I won't, and it just didn't seem like something, and it just really didn't interest me. It was just summoning something else. Again, kind of going back to demonology with Warlock. That's kind of the direction they went, which you have to summon all these demons and things. And to me, it's just not fun. It's just not enjoyable when you're just sitting there hitting a bunch of buttons to do something. I would prefer to, you know, there's a lot of synergy with the way these work. So you're thinking about, okay, what do I need to do? I need to do this. I need to do that. I hit with Beast Mastery the way it is right now. It kind of has a, you kind of have a kind of a mini burst damage, and then you kind of have a full-on pop everything. So if you do Bestial Wrath, okay, that has a shorter 1.5, again, kind of in the middle. It's a shorter cooldown. If you're trying to kill a rare, or you know, something, you know, some kind of mini boss or something, you have Aspect of the Wild, you have trinkets, you have other things you can use. So, you know, everything's working together. Bestial Wrath is synergizing with Kill Command, Cobra Shot, things like that. You know, you have 2 charges of Barbed Shot, you have Chimera Shot. So, I mean, everything kind of has a multiple use for what it does, which that I kind of like, because it's making you think about what you're doing. So this just didn't really, to me, it just didn't really seem like it fit in with that. So, Killer Cobra seemed like, anytime I've ever played Beast Mastery, Kill Command's generally been your biggest hitting ability. Your rotation kind of always revolved around this, and I think that's still true, even though Barb Shot does slightly more damage. Chimera Shot, the nature damage and the frost damage is separate, 2 separate enemies, so it's not combined damage. So it still is your biggest hitting ability. And being able to spam it. I admit I was expecting, with the stat squish, it's not this big kind of burst damage that maybe you would think it would be. You do get pretty decent damage. If I found myself trailing in damage, I would start to spam Cobra Shot in fights, and that seems to kind of help pick up my DPS a little bit, especially against other hunters. I've been pretty well on par. I've been doing either exactly the same amount of damage as other hunters, or just slightly less. And when I mean slightly less, I mean within 1,000 or 2 difference. So, yeah. So not too bad. You have some choices. I think with these talents, you have maybe more of a choice, more versatility in what you take, more. Granted, they are not the old talent trees compared to other specs and other classes. I think you probably have more choice with these talents than you do with most. I think that's a fair statement because I'm actually trying things. I'm thinking, okay, well, that was a good ability. Can I switch something else and make it better? Or can I go back to this or go back to that? And I mostly settled on this because this was the setup that I've had the most fun with playing. And as I said, I've been able to solo players in PvP and capture bases and whatnot. So yeah, not too bad. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope that was helpful for you, and thank you for watching.